So today we're going to just do one section that I accidentally skipped on Wednesday, and that's going to be about some more muscle stuff. So we're going to start with how we name muscles, and we're going to go from there. And it's not that long, but we do still need to know it for the section. So, all right. So when we talk about muscle organs, like the actual specific ones in the body, there's a couple different things we like to know. So obviously we like to know the name of the muscle and where it actually is. And when we want to know where it actually is, it's not just a matter of like pointing to it on a diagram. We typically specifically talk about how or where it's attached to other body parts. And usually that does mean attachment to bone, but occasionally it does mean attachment to other things. And then the other thing we like to know is what the muscle does. So we call that the muscle action, or actions plural, because a lot of muscles have multiple actions. The old school way of talking about the attachments are origin and insertion, and I'll define those, but what you guys need to know is just attachment. So an attachment between muscle and bone is generally called a tendon. Sometimes the muscle is actually attached to skin, and occasionally the muscle is attached to the connective tissue of another muscle, so the fascia between muscles. Now tendons, although we typically think about them as sort of a round, long thing, they're not always visible. Sometimes they're really, really short, and it's just collagen fibers connecting the epimysium of the muscle to the periosteum of the bone. So very, very short. And so we have different names for that, which I'll touch on. So muscles are going to always have at least 2 attachments, and they're going to cross at least 1 joint. So when the attachment looks like what we traditionally think of as a tendon, we call it an indirect attachment. And even with an indirect attachment where we have a distinct tendon, which remember is dense, regular connective tissue, which means lots and lots of collagen bundles all running in parallel, the collagen fibers are going to be continuous. So from the epimysium to the periosteum and all the way into the bone matrix, we have a continuity of collagen fibers. It makes for very strong attachment types. So when it's a round ropey thing, we call it a tendon. When it's a flat indirect attachment, we call it an aponeurosis. These are the most common types of muscle attachments. But sometimes, as I mentioned before, we can't actually see the connective tissue. So in that case, we call it a direct attachment because it looks like the muscle is coming directly off of the bone. And essentially, although the collagen fibers are still there, they're so short that the epimysium is basically fused to the periosteum. So those are our 2 basic kinds. Basically, if you can see it, it's an indirect attachment, and if you cannot see the connective tissue, it's direct. So here's some examples of both. So here's our biceps, and our biceps has 2 proximal attachments, and then 1 distal attachment, and they're all indirect, so you can see the tendon. The trapezius muscle is this guy back here, and it's got basically an aponeurosis here and a direct attachment to the scapula. And then up here we have another direct attachment of the deltoid, and then another aponeurosis on the latissimus dorsi. So different types of attachments just based on what the muscle is. You can see some of them are very broad, some of them are very narrow. If you get into this in more detail later on, and I may have shown you a little bit of this before, but You can also see where muscles attach to bone with diagrams drawn on the bone. So this is showing you different attachment sites and different colors of the various muscles that cover these bones. And in here we see them specified as origins and insertions. So origins are the attachments where they don't typically move when the muscle contracts, and the insertions are the ones that do. Usually origins are proximal and insertions are distal. However, because muscles can have multiple actions, the site that moves can change. And so origin insertion is not accurate enough. So attachment is always right. So that's why we're just going to stick to attachment. So that's what they are, and you'll see them, but we're not going to worry about knowing what those are. We're just going to call them all attachments, direct or indirect. So actions, we have some more detail for that too. Any effect produced by a muscle contraction is called a muscle action. And that can be whether it produces movement or prevents movement. So when the muscle contracts, sometimes it's actually stopping a movement from happening, and that's still a muscle action. Now that makes sense when we realize that muscles act together. So muscle groups are all of the muscles that work together to make a specific movement happen. And so whichever role a muscle has in a muscle group for a specific movement, we give them different names for their roles. So the three roles that we have for muscle action. The prime mover, which is also called an agonist, is whichever muscle produces most of the force for a particular action. And this is typically when that action is causing movement. An antagonist is one whose action opposes the prime mover. And so this is usually preventing or controlling movement. And then other muscles that are also involved in the group activity are called synergists. Typically, synergists aid in the agonist or the prime mover's activity. They can do that by adding power to the movement, so doing the exact same thing as the prime mover, but not contributing as much of the force. They can also stabilize joints that need to stay still. So when you have muscles that cross more than one joint, but you only want the movement to occur at one of those joints, you want to keep the other one still. They can also modify the direction of the agonist movement, so altering the prime mover's action. And they can prevent bone and muscle origins from moving as well. So if we want things to not move on one side of a joint, they can do that too. We see that a lot, for example, with the scapula. So a lot of arm movements, we want the scapula to stay still where it is against your back. And so we have a lot of muscles up there that hold it steady when we move our arm at the shoulder. So that's one of the ways that we can prevent bone from moving using synergists. So here we go back to our biceps picking up a cup, typical example. So our biceps is the prime mover when we want to flex at the elbow. And there are a couple different synergists that aid in adding to force to that movement. So this little guy down here is a synergist, brachioradialis. And this little guy that's actually deep to the biceps, the brachialis, does the same thing. Let's see, I can't remember if I have another slide. No, I don't. Okay. Now, there's also an antagonist that's not pictured. So the triceps, which is located on the opposite side of the arm, the triceps brachii, is the antagonist in this action. So when you're flexing at the elbow, you're using these muscles to move your arm. And this muscle, when it's allowed to act, extends at the elbow. So when we're flexing, this muscle can work a little bit to help control that movement. So this is an example of when we're using those eccentric, isotonic contractions as part of our muscle actions. So the biceps and all of its synergists are going to be using concentric isotonic contractions to lift a cup. And the triceps is going to be using eccentric if it's needed to contract it all to control that movement. We can also see roles switch depending on the activity. So if we reverse and we set the cup down and we start extending at the elbow, then the triceps is going to become the agonist or prime mover. So now extension makes the triceps the prime mover. And the biceps becomes the antagonist. They have opposite actions. So we can usually have a pretty good guess as to what our muscles do when they contract, what their primary action is based on their attachments. So the muscle's origin and insertion, aka attachments, are going to determine its actions. Please tell me I did. All right, so when we look at the actions of flexion and extension, so remember flexion and extension usually occur in the sagittal plane, so forwards or backwards, and flexion is decreasing the angle between two bones, and extension is increasing the angle between two bones. Most joints are set up so that flexion occurs anteriorly or to the front, and extension typically occurs posteriorly or to the back. And that means that muscles that cross the anterior side of a joint, so for example, the biceps crossing the anterior aspect of the elbow, or the example they're giving here, the pectoralis major crossing the anterior aspect of the shoulder joint, they're going to produce flexion and bring the joint forward. And then the opposite is also usually true. So muscles that cross the posterior side of a joint, like this guy, the latissimus dorsi, crosses the posterior aspect of the shoulder joint, or what we just talked about, the triceps crosses the posterior aspect of the elbow joint, they're going to cause extension. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So when you think about the action at your knee, that's obviously opposite, right? So for the knee, because the knee is set up to flex posteriorly, muscles that are on the posterior side of the knee joint that cross that are going to cause flexion, and muscles on the anterior side are going to cause extension. So it does depend on how the joint is set up, but most joints are set up so that these are true. And then we can see the same thing with abduction, adduction. So because abduction is movement away from midline, laterally placed muscles, so muscles that cross joints along the lateral aspect, are going to produce abduction. So in this case, the deltoid crosses the shoulder joint on the lateral aspect. So when we flex the deltoid, we raise our shoulders and abduct. Muscles that are going to cross the medial side of a joint are going to produce adduction. And so this little guy here is called the teres major. It goes between the scapula and the humerus here. So you can see it's medial to the shoulder joint. And so when that flexes, it causes adduction and lets you bring your arms closer to your sides. So like I said, we can take a reasonable guess at what a prime action of a muscle does. Now, it's harder to figure out the synergistic effects. So there are plenty of muscles where it can be a little bit harder to figure out exactly what they do, but we can at least guess what types of actions they're involved with, because how they cross the joint is literally going to determine what happens to that joint when they contract. The other thing that we can look at here is with muscle shape. So we talked about how we can categorize bones based on shape, and we actually do the same thing with muscle. And we do it for a particular reason, and it's kind of related to how we do it with the bone as well. And that's because the shape of the muscle can often dictate its strength and its range of motion. So muscle shape is all based around how the fascicles, those bundles of skeletal muscle fibers, are arranged with respect to the tendon that attaches that muscle to bone. So how those fascicles are arranged controls how much power the muscle can produce, as well as how contracted it can actually be. And we have 5 basic patterns of arrangement that we see in our skeletal muscles. So we'll go through them one at a time, but these are the overviews. So parallel is when the fascicles are all literally running the same direction as the tendon, and the entire muscle is of uniform width. Fusiform, you may remember, means that it's tapered on either end and bulging in the middle, and that is the shape of a fusiform muscle. So it's similar to parallel, but it's thicker in the middle, and the tendon's running all the way through. Convergent muscle is fan-shaped. So one attachment is very focal, and on the other side of it, we have this very broad distribution. And the tendon comes down here. Pennate are feather-shaped, and that means the fascicles are arranged at an angle to a tendon so that it looks like a feather or a leaf. And then circular is exactly how it sounds. They literally go around in a circle. So let's look at those in more detail. Parallel. So parallel, literally where they're all running in the exact same direction as the tendon. And these can either be more cylindrical, like an actual round muscle where all the fascicles run together, or they can be more like a flat sheet. For example, rectus abdominis, what we usually think of as our abs, is a flat sheet of fascicles all running in a superior and inferior direction. And in general, with all of these muscles, the muscle fiber part is called the muscle belly, and that's as opposed to the part that's mostly, if not all, tendon. So when we look at fusiform, we see that the difference is that the muscle belly aspect, that central part where it's all muscle fibers, is of a wider diameter, but the fibers are still basically running in parallel or near parallel to the direction of the tendon. And we can also have this happen where they start from different places and then all come together. So this is actually very similar to how our triceps muscle that we just talked about is set up. It's got 2 attachments proximally, and then it comes, well, it actually should have, it has 3, sorry, which is where the tri comes in. And then seps refers to the muscle bellies, and then they all come down and insert in one place, which is actually on your elbow. So that slight tapering is what makes fusiform different from parallel. And then convergent is very different. So very much fan-shaped. And oftentimes the attachment of the one side, the broad attachments of the fascicles, is a direct attachment. You can definitely see that here on this temporalis muscle. That's a chewing muscle, the one that bulges over here when you chew. All converging and coming down here on your mandible or your jawbone. And here is that pectoralis major we looked at before. Very broad attachments here on the ribs and the sternum and the clavicle, all coming down to one teeny tiny little tendinous attachment on the humerus to really allow that flexion at the shoulders. Okay, so that's convergent, shaped like a fan. So when something's converging, everything's all coming together. And then our circular are also called sphincters. And that's because when you have a muscle where the fascicles are arranged in a circle, when they contract, they actually make the opening in the middle smaller. And anything that does that is able to regulate the flow through there, and that is what a sphincter is. So we describe it as a concentrically arranged fascicles, and they're actually attaching essentially, so you can have them where they're attaching in half circles, but really the fascicles are running all the way around and attaching to the same thing. So we actually have circular muscle around each eye, and that's what lets us close our eyelids really tight. And we have one all the way around our mouth as well. Those are not the only ones we have, but they're the most easy to recognize, as we see them on the face as soon as you look at a picture without skin on it. So circular or sphincter ones regulate the size of the opening, whether that is eyes and mouth, or whether we're looking at things like, digestive system and stuff like that. And then the last one, it's a little more complicated. So pennate muscles are the ones where the fascicles are all arranged in an angle. So similar to the convergent, but everybody's coming at the same angle, so it looks kind of like fusiform. So we have a nice big muscle belly, fascicles coming in at kind of sort of like a 45, somewhere in the 30 to 60, I would say, angle, but you can see they're more upright here. Very similar to how a feather is arranged, and then the tendon is running like this. So we have a lot of them, a lot of muscles like this. These are very strong muscles. So this deltoid is actually one of them. Show you another picture. And then there's different subcategories of pennate depending on how many sides of the tendon we have fascicles on. So when they're all on one side of the tendon, and it's unipennate. When it's on two sides and it really does look like a feather, it's bipennate. And then they can actually be multiple, because it's a three-dimensional thing, and that's what the deltoid has going on. It's a multipennate muscle belly, where they're coming in from multiple angles. But they're all pennate. And let me see if I got, yeah, there we go. So there's a nice summary. So we talked last time about the fact that one of the major things about muscle strength is how much cross-bridge formation we can have. And so the number of muscle fibers is a major factor in how much strength or force can be generated. So when we have muscles like convergent and pennate muscles, we have a lot of fascicles, a lot of muscle fibers that are contracting all at once. And so these are very strong muscle types. And we can kind of contrast that with our fusiform or our parallel muscles, where the number of fibers on cross section is not as high. And so these are not going to be as strong, but because everybody's running in parallel, we get much more shortening when these contract. So these are better at shortening. And so we're going to find these in places where we want to be able to drastically change the angle at the joint, because we need a lot of shortening to do that. These are going to be the multipennate, or any of the pennates and the convergence. They're going to be anywhere where strength is more important than degree of shortening. And then obviously the circular guys, it's not about strength or shortening, it's about controlling the inside. Yeah, okay, just a couple more things here. So another thing that we do when we talk about muscle categories is we talk about whether or not they're actually on the part of the body that is being controlled or that's being moved by that muscle. And this is kind of a weird subjective category. So intrinsic muscles are located on the part of the body that they move. Extrinsic muscles are going to be nearby, and they're going to attach on that body part, because if they're not, then they can't move it, but they're not actually on it. So the difference just depends on which part of the body you're talking about. So for example, there are muscles in my hand. There are also muscles in my foot. So all the muscles in my foot are intrinsic muscles of the foot. They move the foot and they're on the foot. But there are lots of muscles on the leg like muscles of the calf and stuff that move my foot as well, because they have tendons that attach down there. But because the muscle itself is not located on the foot, they are considered extrinsic foot muscles. Same thing on my hand. I have muscles in my hand that are intrinsic because they're in my hand and they move my hand. But I also have muscles on my forearm that move my hand, but they are located here, so they're extrinsic. However, if I wanted to talk about all the muscles that move my whole arm, I can talk about every single muscle on my arm as intrinsic to my arm, and then muscles that are attached up here on my chest and my back are my extrinsic arm muscles because they can move my arm, but they are not located on my arm. So this is, as I said, subjective based on the body part you're talking about. But when you're looking at muscles that control things, you'll see them categorized in this way because they're different locations. Just a little bit on naming muscles, because we're not going to cover specific muscles in this course. That's what we typically do when we have a lab portion. So if you take further courses, you'll find that knowing the names and locations of muscles are going to be much more important when you actually have a lab, because then you're going to have to learn these specific muscles. There are lots of resources online to do that with, as well as, you know, various textbooks and stuff. But I just like to point out that Gray's Anatomy, which is sort of the classic textbook of anatomy, to the point where they named a show after it and then named the character Gray to make it sound like that's why it was called that, is accessible online. It's got some pretty cool illustrations. That's the website for it. So if you're curious and you want to see some really good anatomical illustrations, you can go on there. Not anything you need for the class, but just something I like to share. I think that's everything. Yep. All right, so if anybody has questions about any of this, of course, please email me. I do not want to keep those annotations, and let me make sure there's nothing else I wanted to say. And we will be having a review on Monday, so if you have questions where you want a live answer, please make sure you're studying before that, because then the test will be available through Tuesday, covering the muscular system, the skeletal system, as well as the integumentary system. So that'll be your last chance to ask me live. Will be lecture time on Monday. So I will hopefully see a lot of you there, and hope everybody has a productive weekend.